Alex, with Syria, as Bashar al-Assad said in one of his interviews that I've just watched it. It's from the past, but he said the problem with Libya was not Gaddafi; it was Libya itself. For the case of Iraq, was the identity of Iraq, and the case of Syria, it seems to be the same. That Israel doesn't want a Syria; it's a united Syria. On the other hand, you have these Al Qaeda and jihadists in Syria. They have total excuse to go and bomb Syria. What's going on when you look at Syria today and the way that Israelis are attacking Syria? We know that the government in Syria tried to do everything to appease the government, the Netanyahu administration. But after all, they're not satisfied. Your take on what's going on there?
Well, very unfortunately, we might be looking at an at a greater military escalation in Syria, which could engulf the whole region, which is, it favors the side that prefers chaos, and the strategy of chaos has for the long time been the preferred method of foreign policy by the Western Empire. And here I would, the chief culprits with a long historical tradition of doing this would be former European colonial powers, Great Britain and France. And they essentially created the mess that is now festering still and erupting into a greater conflict. And that is the Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1916, which created arbitrary divisions across the Arab world that cut across, tribal, sectarian territories almost deliberately so that they could keep them disunited, that they could continue to pit them one against the other and to dominate them in this way, because it's the simple approach of divide and rule. And it seems to me that they're still doing this. And of course, then in 1917 we had the Balfour Declaration and the beginning of the formation of Israel, which again completely comes from out of London. The preparation started already in the late 19th century. Then we had the Balfour Declaration, and in 1948, the creation of Israel. Israel's sole purpose there is to be the beachhead, to keep the region destabilized, and to use it in order to maintain Western hegemony in the region. If you keep parties at war nonstop, and you're the one with the monopoly on financial capital and on credit, you have the global monopoly on advanced high-tech weaponry and other types of technology, for communications, for oil drilling, pipelines, all the technologies that are necessary for industrial development and production of energy and transport and so on. Well, then, if you keep everybody at war against the other, you keep them from developing, but you also make them dependent on you for money, because once you go to war, first thing you need is going to be credit. And then immediately you're going to have to spend a lot of that credit, if not all of it, on weaponry, which again, you're going to be buying from BAE Systems and so forth, which are one of the major arms merchant in the Middle East. So this divide and conquer, constant flaming of the war escalations is coming ultimately from London and then also from Paris. And we still have there, military and naval presence of French ships, American ships, British ships. But the difference now is that Trump is trying to extricate the United States from that region. And I know that it doesn't seem that way, because a lot of people are interpreting Trump's action quite as the opposite. But I'm, the more I'm observing events and politics in the United States itself, the more I'm convinced that Trump is actually trying to extricate the United States from these imperial misadventures. I don't think that he's a very sincere friend of Benjamin Netanyahu or a sincere ally of the state of Israel. And I think that he's genuinely looking to partner up with uh, nations like Iran, Russia, China, and others. And Israel is, in fact, the only reason why this is the only obstacle in the way of all that. And it's a very costly obstacle because, you know, the United States doesn't really have a whole lot of upside from supporting Israel, but it has a huge amount of downside. You know, it's keeping it at war. It's keeping it constantly at a risk of being dragged into a quagmire, particularly against Iran. And that would be a quagmire that the United States has no chance of winning. So it's a, you know, very, very, very little to gain, maybe not even that, maybe nothing to gain, with the potential of a catastrophic, a cataclysmic disaster happening to the United States on account of Israel. I think that the, you know, the logic of all this is so obvious and so straightforward that the only thing that's keeping the United States from completely shifting their alliance, their allegiances, is this very strong, very powerful political bloc, which are the Zionist Jews in the United States and the, you know, the evangelical Christians, which are, for very strange and irrational reasons, uh, completely and fanatically devoted to the state of Israel. They believe that somehow it's biblical, it's prophetic, it's the Armageddon, it's going to be the second coming of Christ, it's going to be the coming of Messiah. The Israelis, a good segment of the Israeli Jews who are, let's say, religious enough to even consider these things, they think that there's going to be a big battle of Armageddon, and that only after, you know, Israel has been practically destroyed and punished by practically the whole world, will there be the coming of the Messiah that's been promised to them since the biblical time. So, you know, what people think and what they believe, we're delving into extremely strange things. But when you know, clear out the analysis to just, you know, pros and cons, the gains and losses that, you know, the United States can obtain in different ways of relating to Israel, to Iran, to Syria, to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia, and so on. Israel is a major problem for the United States, and I very much doubt that this is not patently obvious to Donald Trump.
But do you feel that he's somehow dealing with Netanyahu, or is somehow trying to appease Netanyahu, or his administration tries to appease Netanyahu? From what we've seen so far, how did you find the relationship between the two administrations?
It's very hard to judge from what we know, but I see that the relationship is not. It doesn't seem to me friendly on Trump's side. It doesn't seem friendly from Netanyahu's side either. Netanyahu is desperate. He absolutely needs the American support, because no American support, it means the end of Israel very quickly, right? And so he desperately needs the American support, and he's maneuvering to make sure that he doesn't lose that support. On the other hand, Trump cannot show himself to be hostile to Israel, even though, you know, from Trump we had different signals. Remember when Jeffrey Sachs a few months ago had a video on X where he said that Benjamin Netanyahu is a deep, dark son of a bitch, and then more, you know, and then Trump reposted this in one of his posts, and we saw that when Trump went and made a tour of the Middle East, he skipped Israel. He didn't go there. and mm, he has expressed sharp criticism of Israel for their bombing of Iran, which is kind of unique in American political life, because normally everybody has a knee-jerk reaction. Whatever Israel does, Israel has the right to defend herself. That's the only thing you're ever going to hear. So the fact that Trump was saying that he's not very happy with them, and then when people were trying to suggest that, well, it's actually Iran's fault, and he said, yeah, but I'm actually, he was actually putting the weight of his criticism on Israel. And then we also know that Benjamin Netanyahu went to the United States for I don't know if he's still there, but he's been there for a few days, and they had many meetings, and some of these meetings didn't go well. And we know that at least on one occasion, Donald Trump stormed out of the meeting with Netanyahu. There was no joint press conference after that, so we don't know what happened. But it doesn't seem that the relationship is easy. And from everything I gather, it seems to me that Trump is very serious about getting both Iran and Israel to stand down and to stop attacking one another. It seems to me that he's really keen on making sure that the relationship, that the region stays at peace. This we've known for the last month, since the 12-day war ended. But we've also, on one of our previous podcasts, we've talked about Syria, that it will be relatively easy, and I mentioned the British hand in Syria, that it will be relatively easy for the British to get something going in Syria, to use Syria to again cause an arson attack against peace in the region. And now I think we see that. And as Kemi Badenoch gave away in one of her recent interviews in Britain, she said that Israel is fighting a proxy war on the behalf of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom does not have interest in there being peace in the region. Their interest is to keep the region destabilized and to eventually bring about the regime change in Iran. Trump said explicitly that he's not looking to do a regime change in Iran. The British are saying that they want a regime change in Iran. We saw just this week a statement from Lord, what is his name? I have to look it up. Lord Beamish, who went and gave a whole statement about why Iran is a great threat to the British, to Great Britain, to the British people, and to British interests. And so it's always that side that is stirring the pot in the Middle East, as they do elsewhere, as they do in the Ukraine, as they're preparing to do in the Balkans. And I think that Trump is actually trying to do something completely different.
I want to talk about Iran, but before getting to Iran and the case of Iran, we have a country which, in my opinion, is so important, but you see little coming out of, just they're doing nothing but making chaos. It's called Turkey.
Azerbaijan?
No, I'm talking about Turkey, and they're in Syria. They're trying to do something in the northern part of Lebanon. And do you feel that, because many people are arguing that Erdogan is somehow pursuing a new empire, an Ottoman Empire, and all of these things. But after all, do you see anything good coming out of these moves, political moves on the part of the government in Turkey, in the way that they're involved in Syria? They're trying to do nothing, considering what's going on in Gaza, but just lip service and just talking about the situation. And you see the case of Azerbaijan, as you've mentioned. How do you see the role of Turkey in whole calculation?
Well, it seems to me that Turkey, particularly Erdogan and the Turkish deep state and intelligence apparatus, is on board with the British foreign policy, uh, contributing to the destabilization of the region. And so we know now that the Turks have collaborated with the British MI6 and the British foreign policy establishment in cultivating the Al Nusra Front. They created together the HTS militia, and they cultivated Al Jolani and Al Shibani and a whole bunch of these jihadis. They kind of rebranded them as reformers, as new democratic front in Syria and so forth, and they have presented them to the world as such. We know that the Turks have been handling the HTS from the strategic military aspect, but the public relations side has been handled by the British. Now, how does this come about? Well, there's a part of the political class in Turkey which see in all this an opportunity to re-establish some form of an Ottoman Empire, right? And many of them, believe that Aleppo and parts of Syria and Lebanon actually should belong to Turkey. It should be rightfully a Turkish territory. And so this, let's call it, this ambition has been exploited by the British to kind of co-opt Turkey into their orbit, into their geopolitical concept. And the current head of the MI6, Sir Richard Moore, has been one of the main proponents of this concept of Great Turania, right? The Great Turania would be some kind of a political union of the Turkic people across the Central Asia, because you have these Turkic peoples that it goes from Turkey across to Azerbaijan, and then you have Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all the way to China. These are all Turkic people, right? And they share a common language and a common culture and so forth. And so, for Erdogan, as his political legacy, it would be appealing to emerge as a great uniter of the Turkic people and creating, this, if this entity stretches across the bulk of the Eurasian continent, that's a very, very powerful position to be in, because this is where China's One Belt One Road initiative has many of its transport routes that are extremely important for China's strategic plans, and the Russians, and the international north-south transport corridor, which goes from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Baltic Sea. That one would cut across this greater Turania, So it's a very good way for the British, for the Western Empire, to derail Chinese and Russian and BRICS, the whole BRICS approach to the international development, and Iran is absolutely the central pivot point in that whole concept. And so to try to cater to these ambitions of Turkic leaders like Erdogan and Aliyev in Azerbaijan is a way to bribe them into coming to your side. And then they say, like, hey, you could make all this happen, but we have to sabotage the Chinese Russian project. We have to derail their development objectives, and then we'll create this greater Turania, and you're going to be the you're going to be the big sultans and rulers of this massive, very wealthy political entity. And so this is very, very typical British. They always make promises, and they always try to appeal to their target proxies by giving them something that they might be secretly dreaming about, and they say like, hey, we'll make it happen, we'll help you make this happen, and you're going to help us by regime changing Iran, by weakening Russia, by supporting Ukraine, by derailing this north-south, by partitioning Iran, maybe breaking off Tehran from the Caspian coast and so on. So this is where this is all coming from, Nima. But I have this is clear enough, but I have a suspicion that this is not a particularly strong card to play, because if it were a strong card, they wouldn't wait for the moment of absolute desperation to play that card, because the derailing of the Eurasian integrations and Russia and the Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to happen by imposing a proxy war through Ukraine on Russia. Well, they lost that one. And so now the British have signed a military cooperation agreement with Azerbaijan. They sent recently a military attaché to Baku for the first time ever. And then I think it was last month or in May, they signed a military cooperation agreement with Kazakhstan. Why does Kazakhstan need to have a military cooperation agreement with the British? I don't understand, but I know why British might like to, start to developing their intelligence network among the security services of Kazakhstan, because, they're going to be running out of the last Ukrainian. So better think about the next beachhead, to start to impose war and destabilization efforts against Russia. So anyway, this is where it comes from. These are the vestiges of the British imperial system. London is still very much keen on perpetuating all that. And so activating their networks in Turkey, HTS, taking over Damascus. Vanessa Billy, who is now in Lebanon, but she used to be a correspondent from Damascus, she said that every 4-star hotel in Damascus is packed with British agents, with whether it be NGOs or private contractors or flat out foreign policy, foreign office personnel, but British are crawling all over Damascus now. And well, the good news is that the Russians understand what the game is. The Iranians understand what the game is. In a very strange turn of event, the Iranians, after yesterday's bombardment of Damascus by the Israelis, the Iranians reached out to al-Jawlani and offered cooperation, which is very, very interesting. Again, an indication they absolutely understand what the game is and who the real enemy is. And the Chinese understand the game. And I also more and more strongly believe that Trump understands what the game is and that he's on the right side of history, because somebody who is in the know, it was Susan Kokinda of the Promethean Action Committee, who is very politically active, but she told me that in a recent cabinet meeting about all these Middle Eastern events in Washington, that Trump on several occasions during the meeting made a point of calling America's enemies, Iran, Russia, China. He said, our so-called enemies, and he also called them the people that are perceived to be our enemies. That's a very strange way to formulate, what you mean to say, but it's very clear that he's not buying that Iran is an enemy to the United States, that Russia is an enemy to the United States, that China is an enemy. He understands who the real enemy is, and so that's all bad news for the undead British Empire, because now they have very powerful constellation of regional powers arrayed against them, and they know what the game is. And the British, the whole British thing depends on people with very thin hold on power. Like UAE is important as a new, let's say, new Middle Eastern financial center. Qatar is important as a new, let's call it, intelligence special forces headquarters for the Western Empire. Um, Damascus is now important, but what? Damascus is ruled by a foreigner imposed by the Turks and the British. That's not going to go very far. Israel is important, but Israel is in its dying agony. And then, like, they have a government in Lebanon that doesn't really have the support of the people, and Hezbollah is still strong, refuses to disarm, and does have the support of the people. So I think that all of this stuff that this little cabal in London is doing with the ruling families of UAE and Qatar and the deep state of Turkey and these jihadis in Damascus, I don't think that will actually be sustainable for the long term, and I think that ultimately they will fail.
Alex, how do you see the role of British in the Arab states, especially in Qatar? And do you feel they're playing the same?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, the British have been have a very, very close cooperation with Qatar. Again, a military alliance. The Qataris are, I think, they're the only country in the world that actually shares military bases with the British on the British mainland. And they have two military bases in England where they train their pilots. So the Qatari military pilots are being trained in the United Kingdom, and they have a very, very close intelligence cooperation with the Qataris. The Qatari intelligence agencies with the British intelligence agencies, and they coordinate foreign policy together. Let's remember that when the October 7, 2023 attack in Israel happened, it was kind of coordinated with the Hamas leadership, which is also being coddled in luxury in Qatar, right? These are a handful of Hamas leaders who enjoy a life of luxury in Qatar, fly around on private jets. Absolutely do not share the agony of the Gaza people, and they were I think that they were instrumental in orchestrating the October 7 attacks in Israel, and they were this was done obviously not by Hamas leaderships that one day decided, hey, let's do this. It was I think coordinated with the Israeli and British involvement, and I think that if you know what happened and how it happened, it's absolutely clear that October 7 was a false flag attack. That it was orchestrated to happen that way. That its purpose was to result in a large number of civilian casualties in order to galvanize the Israeli society for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and also the West Bank. And this is what we have today. It didn't happen randomly. It was done to happen that way. And then we also have to always remember that one of the people who has been deeply involved in all things Middle East, because the British imperative is to not only defend their hegemony in the region, but to bring it to the level they had during their colonial days, of the 19th century, before World War One. And so one of the key linchpins of all of this has been Tony Blair, back in the shadows. He's not in the news. He's not out making statements about, Al-Jolani, about Iran, but you can see that he's involved. And his former chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, is deeply involved in networking with the jihadi groups that have now overtaken Syria, and also rebranding them so that to the Western public they seem very reasonable. If you go to Davos meet this year in 2025, Tony Blair actually interviewed Assad al-Shibani, the current foreign minister of Syria. He interviewed him in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and al-Shibani gave all these answers that you thought like, oh, well, this is a really nice young man, such reasonable answers. I mean, they want democracy, they want to empower women. I swear this was part of the discussion. They want freedom and prosperity for the Syrian people and peace and stability in the region. I mean, who wouldn't want to take this guy home and introduce him to his daughters, right? Wonderful, just wonderful. But what you saw actually is exactly this public relations stunt, so that everybody thinks like, oh, now we're rid of that evil Bashar al-Assad and these really nice people are there. And look, Tony Blair is interviewing him and we can all see how really nice he is. Well, that's part of the whole mix, because probably the most important audience for all this is actually the Western public, because we are the ones that have to acquiesce, that we have to consent to the new redrawing of the Middle Eastern map, and to regime change Iran, and to bring the Shah, which the British and the Israelis have been coddling and cultivating as the next leader. And so Qatar in this whole equation is the important how do you call it, kind of like intelligence, diplomacy, special forces headquarters for the region. But the problem is that Qatar is a little nothing. It can be wiped out easily, and they're a terrible irritant to the Iranians, and they're a terrible irritant to the Saudis themselves. Like the Saudis hate the Qataris. And, they're not taking action now, but, it could easily happen that the circumstances in the region say that, Mohammed bin Salman and the Iranian leadership say, okay, let's clean this up. And then there's no more Qatar very easily. Who's going to defend them? Nobody's going to be able to defend them.
Alex, when it comes to Iran and Russia and China, recently we had the foreign minister of China talking about how they're trying to help Iran to defend Iran's dignity and Iran's sovereignty, and all of these sort of talks that are happening behind the scene, I would argue, between Iran, Russia, and China in the aftermath of the attack on Iran. I think that a lot happening behind the scene that we are not aware of in terms of the Iranian defense system, how they're trying to rebuild the Iranian defense system, reconstruct that, and make a better position for Iran if any sort of attack happens in the near future. How do you feel the way that Russia and China are behaving in the aftermath of the attack on Iran? We had on the other hand, we had the Israeli sources. I don't know if you saw the article in Axis talking about behind the scene, Putin is trying to convince Iranian for zero enrichment. Iranians are not happy with the support they received from Russia during the war with Israel. They're trying to smear everything between Iran and Russia, draw a line between the two nations. But all the sources that they're talking about in Israel or in Europe, it's so interesting.
Yeah. Nima, I suspect that these are all psyops, because they are, they're desperate to derail the relations between Russia and Iran. And they're also very desperate to derail the relations between Russia and the United States, because they want to isolate everybody and they want everybody to only talk to them. But we know that I think that just yesterday or the day before, Antony Blinken, of all people, said gave an interview to one of your compatriots. What is her
Christian
name?
Amanpour.
Christian
Yeah.
Amanpour, the valiant CNN journalist. And Anthony Blinken made a few very stunning revelations there, in which he said that actually the Iranians were ready to limit their nuclear uranium enrichment to I think something like 0.67%, not even 3.7. And so if Iranians were ready to do that in order to have peace and to lift sanctions, then how did we even end up in all these problems? So somebody has used heavy-handed deception in order to mount this regime change initiative against Iran. And I think that again we have to place the United Kingdom at the very top of the list of suspects, because we talked about this before, but in 2019 it was the British who tried very hard to persuade Donald Trump into launching an attack against Iran. So it was after the downing of the Reaper, I think, one of those big drones that the Americans fly over the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians downed it, and then there was this big lobbying effort to try to persuade Trump into starting a war basically against Iran, and he said no. And then there was this hysterical exchange of messages between the British embassy and the Foreign Office, berating Trump, criticizing him, calling him names because he refused to start war against Iran. But it was the British who wanted that war to happen and who mounted this whole diplomatic front against Trump to persuade him to do it. So it's been them all along, nonstop, always mixed in, but always acting behind the scene, because they want the Americans to do the dirty work. And then when the Americans do the dirty work, then British often emerge and they pretend to be very critical of the Americans because of their the use of force, and they shouldn't do this, and it's terrible and it's ugly. But we're here to help things, and we're going to bring peace and stability, and we're going to lead the negotiations. By the way, we're going to take it upon ourselves. We're going to negotiate some kind of a peaceful settlement, because we're all about diplomacy and sitting at the table and talk. But it's always the same instigator. And before, when you asked me the question of their cooperation with Qatar, because Qatar, thanks to their relationship with the British, has been one of the, or if not the main financier to all these jihadi groups like Al Qaeda and Al Nusra and Khorasan and all of these splinter groups that emerged in the Middle East of these violent extremist jihadi fanatics. And so there's a researcher called Karin Gevorgian, and she's an expert Orientalist, right? And here's a direct quote from her: "Britain is trying to take the helm of world domination from the United States. One of their tools is control of virtually all radical Islamist movements in the world." So it's not just me saying it. It's if you scratch below the surface and you really look into what's going on and who's stirring the pot in the region, you always come up with the British.
Alex, how do you see the level of cooperation between Iran, Russia, and China in the aftermath of two attacks? One on Russia, which we know, in my opinion, was a British mission on Russian soil on nuclear bombers done by Ukrainians, and the other one, Israelis, maybe behind the scene British were supporting them. We don't know that. But how has these two attacks on Russia and Iran has changed the internal dynamic of the relationship between Iran, Russia, and China. It seems that I would argue on the part of Iran, they're much closer to Russia and China than before. Your take on what's going on in terms of their military, the security of the region, which is so much important when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, as you mentioned, with these jihadists from Syria going to even Turkmenistan, I would argue. And how do you see what's going on between the three important countries?
I think it has only catalyzed a closer cooperation and a closer alliance between the three, because they very heavily depend one on another. So Russia, if let's say if there was a regime change in Iran, and if the West managed to impose the Shah, and the Shah then realigned Iran with Israel, with the West, that would be the end of the international north-south transport corridor, which is very strategically important for Russia, and it's also an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's also, in that sense, extremely important to China, and it also connects India to the northwest, to the northeast of Europe, and the northwest of of Russia. And so for everybody but the Western Empire, this is very important. Now, whoever understands this understands it. They don't need to, they don't need additional evidence in the form of Israeli bombs and American bombs. But you always have a segment, a part of the political class who would like to realign the nation with the West nonetheless, because they'd like to send their children to Oxford and to Harvard, and they maybe have bank accounts in the West, and they would like to buy a house in London, or already have it, or they're connected with the MEK somehow. And they can always argue, well, if we align with the West, then they will lift sanction, and we could develop our economy, and we could be at peace, and blah blah blah. And then like when these bombs fall, then you understand that making friendly overtures to the West is very foolish. They will stab you in the back all the same, even if you give them all the concessions. Because when you make all the concessions that they ask for, then they're going to say, like, okay, hold on 1 minute, let's see about that. And then they're going to come with more demands. They're not going to say, like, well, if you agreed to all this, then we're best friends forever. We can lift all the sanctions. We can be friends and allies. We're going to be investing in your country. You're going to be getting all kinds of capital for development and so on. It never happens that way. They always come back with more demands. And they've done like whatever crisis you analyze through history, it's always the same. 1938, the Sudeten, the crisis between Germany and Czechoslovakia over the Sudeten region in the west of Czechoslovakia. It was the same. They, the Chamberlain government pressured Hitler into making all these extreme demands on the Edvard Beneš government in Prague. And then they pressured Beneš in Prague to concede everything. And then he says, okay, we don't want war. We concede everything. Then they go to Hitler and they say, we got all the concessions, but don't accept. You ask them this and this and this. And then they pile in thing that they know is unacceptable to the other side. Because once you've weakened them to the maximum, then you still want to regime change. You still want to go to war. And this is always the same exact template. Now, one thing, if you understand the where the fault lines are, how they're laid out, and what the war is actually about. And I always go back to that same George Soros thing. It's a war between two systems of governance. You understand that the war is existential for Russia, but it's also existential for Iran and for China, because if the West managed to regime change Russia, then in the very same way that they have used Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, then they would weaponize Russia as a proxy against China. And so once you understand that, then you know that their mutual support is not transactional, that you cannot bribe the Chinese away from supporting Russia, and you cannot bribe the Russians out of supporting Iran and China. And so this is, we got proof of that, because last week the Chinese said there is no way that they will cease supporting Russia in their effort in Ukraine. And this is the reason, because it really is existential, and this really is the war for humanity between the Western Empire, which is the whatever reincarnation of the British Empire that we're looking at, and pretty much the whole rest of humanity, and that includes us in the West. Because if they manage to reach their goal of global domination, let's say they eliminated all the rivals, they eliminated, their regime changed Russia, their regime changed Iran, their regime changed China, well, then their next target would be us. And they already told us what they think. They think we should be hackable animals, that we should be their worker ants. The war on farmers, the elimination of natural foods in favor of crickets and grasshoppers and stuff, and so forth. This is who we're dealing with, and this is who Russia, China, and Iran are opposed to. And I increasingly believe that Trump is also opposed to them, that he's not a, let's say, a co-opted, sold-out ally of this center of power, but that he's actually the enemy to them.